Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? The Reverend Franklin Graham, who calls himself a born-again Christian, says no. President George W. Bush, who calls himself a born-again Christian, says yes. Let's put the question to our guest today. He is the Reverend J. Gottman, pastor of Paducah First Christian Church and adjunct professor of comparative religion here at the college. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We must begin with a comment about your name. Surely you were destined to be a man of the cloth. The name in German means?
Means man of God.
Man of God. Now, being reared Presbyterian, I suppose I should say you were predestined to be a man of God. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
What about the question? Let me go ahead and give you the quotes of both the Reverend Graham, who is a supporter of George Bush, by the way. Here is what he said, and I quote, "Many people after 9/11 said that the Muslims, they worship the same God we do. They just have their way to God. Christians have their way to God, but it's the same God. No, it's not." President Bush told ABC News' Charles Gibson that he believes that both Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Quoting the president, "I think we do. We have different routes of getting to the Almighty. But I want you to understand, I want your listeners to understand, I don't get to decide who goes to heaven. The Almighty God decides who goes to heaven, and I am on my personal walk." So how do you weigh into that issue?
Well, I would have to side with the understanding that it is the same God. And my basis for that is pretty broadly known within religious circles and scholarly circles, in that when you go back to Genesis 18 and begin with the story that starts there with the patriarch Abraham, you find out that our beginnings for both Christianity and Islam have their basis there. Because within Christianity and within Islam, both Abraham and Sarah are looked at as matriarch and patriarch of Christianity and Islam. And those two beginnings come out in the birth narratives of the children. In that story, God has said to Abraham and Sarah, "You will be fruitful and you will multiply, and your children will become a great nation of my people, and I have that covenant with you." And if you know anything about the biblical story, Abraham and Sarah were quite old at the time, and they were becoming impatient to have children. And they decided that the natural custom of the time was, if your wife could not have a child, then you could have a surrogate that would fill in. And that's how the difference of opinion in terms of how these two major faith traditions came into play, because Abraham took Hagar, who was Sarah's maidservant, and had a child with her, and that child was Ishmael. And then later on, God does bless Abraham and Sarah with their own child, and that child is Isaac. And of course, with the societal customs of the time, the oldest child, doesn't matter if it's your biological with your wife or biological with a maidservant, the oldest child gets the lion's share of the inheritance. And as the story goes, Sarah was upset that not her flesh and blood would receive that inheritance. And so she asked Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness, supposedly to die, and hopefully to die is her intent. Abraham puts up a fight, but ultimately gives in to his wife, and he sends his firstborn child and his mother out into the wilderness. And hence, Isaac then becomes the firstborn in terms of household and who is there. And within Christianity and Islam, both of those are under God's covenant, and both give rise to great nations. And Isaac is looked at as the patriarch of what is to become Christianity through the line of ascension that eventually comes through King David to the birth of Jesus. And then the opposite side of the coin is that Ishmael gives rise to the Islamic faith, and the understanding that both of those come from the same God, the same covenant is made with Abraham, and you have two different branches that spring forth from that one patriarch. And so it is the same God in my mind. I think what throws people sometimes is the word Allah. If we were to look at any other ethnic group or any different language, there is a name for God that is used within that particular community. Allah is Arabic for God. Just as in Spanish language, you have Dios, which means God as well. And we get thrown off when we hear
French,
Allah.
Dieu, and of course, Gott for God. Yes.
Exactly, exactly. And so the word, I think, throws people, and then also the great misunderstandings about what Islam is about, and even some of the great misunderstandings about what Christianity has done, both positively and negatively, and that influences people's perceptions. And so I'd have to come down on the side of they're both equal in terms of God's eyes.
Well, let me give you a chance to play the devil's advocate,
Sure.
so to speak. What is Reverend Graham's theological basis for this? And there are others who claim the same thing. What is their theological basis for this?
I think their theological basis comes from, again, the misperception of what Islam is all about. I think there's a misunderstanding that we look at Islam and what we get from the news sources and what we hear historically, some of the negative things in terms of Islam spread by the sword and the violent side that some of the extremists that look at their own faith from Islam take into practice. The extreme views of the Quran and the misguided misinterpretation of their own sacred texts has been used for ill. And I think the theological standpoint is from Christianity, we look at God as being a good and loving God. And I think Graham's interpretation is if it's the same good and loving God, how can there be these terrorist attacks in the name of that same God? And when you look at it from that standpoint, then one could make the assumption that it is not the same God. If it were
But
a
if you
loving
go
God.
back in history, look at all the blood shed in the name of the Prince of Peace. I would go back to the Crusaders,
Yes.
who would slaughter Muslims, slaughter Jews as well, and then go and have a religious service and pray to God after doing this.
Exactly, and I think that's something that gets lost in our historical understanding. In the 11th century, there were four major crusades. The first and the fourth crusades, as you mentioned, the Crusaders not only killed Muslims, but they also killed Jews, and they ransacked, on that first and fourth crusade, the city of Constantinople, which was one of the greatest hearts of
Christian city, sure.
Christianity. When Constantine in 313 made Christianity
Constantine the Great.
the world religion, helped make Christianity what it is today. People forget that, and people forget about the Spanish Inquisition. In 1492, yes, Columbus was in search of new lands and ended up finding the Americas. That was also a great year where Christian believers cast out Jews in Spain because of doctrine and theology and an understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. And so, yes, the Prince of Peace was not very peaceful by followers' standpoint. And there are lots of examples.
Well, sectarian violence in Northern Ireland for years. Those were two types of Christians going at each other.
Exactly.
And you look at the wars of America, Britain, a Christian nation, twice with them. And so it goes. Tell us a little bit about the course. It's a fascinating course, comparative religion. I think that would be a great course to give you a chance to tout the course.
Sure.
Get some students.
Yeah, the World Religions course is fantastic. We spend a semester looking at the major faith traditions. We start out with Hinduism, and Hinduism gave rise through Siddhartha Gautama into Buddhism. We look at
Talk a little bit more, and I think that's a religion that most Americans know very little about. I mean, but you think of Hindus, millions of Hindus in India,
Yes.
Buddhists in Japan and China. Talk a little bit about that religion.
Hinduism and Buddhism are fascinating in that it's a completely different way of looking at the world than the Western traditions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Because within Hinduism and Buddhism, both of those Eastern traditions follow a cyclical cycle in terms of understanding life and the world in which they live. whereas Christianity, Judaism, Islam follow linear understanding. You can plot out points and look historically and say this happened on this date, and you can follow it on through to the present. But within Hinduism and Buddhism, there is the sense that one gets to continue to live out their life until they reach perfection, or until they are able to get off what's called the wheel of life, this endless cycle of birth and death and reincarnation and coming back. And so the goal in both of those faith traditions is to continue making a better life for yourself and moving up through the stations and stages of life. In India, there's a caste system, and there are 4 or 5 castes depending upon who you talk to. Gandhi mentioned the untouchables. That was the base, the very lowest of the low. They were outcasts from society, and then you move up through different branches. You move up through unskilled labor to skilled labor to administrators to the priests. And as one rotates and goes up through different life cycles, they eventually reach a state in their life known as moksha or liberation, and they pass on into what's known as nirvana. And nirvana literally means to extinguish or to blow out. And so they blow out their earthly existence and move on into a state of joining all that there is, and that's known as nothingness. They enter into a state of entering the Supreme Being, which is an existence of nothing, which is very different from Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
Of course, we use the term nirvana to mean paradise. It's utopia. It's heaven, you know.
Yes, and that would be a misunderstanding from a Western culture viewpoint, because there is no sense that an individual soul or an individual actually crosses over into what we think of as heaven or paradise within Islam. The soul is entered into the great mass and energy of the universe. Whereas within Christianity and Islam, there is this sense that one's soul passes on to life eternal, and we move on to be with our Creator. And those are 2 very different concepts, and quite honestly, they're hard concepts for many folks who aren't used to an Eastern mindset to even buy into, or to conceptualize, or to understand. And it's fascinating to hear the debate within class about how students understand that and react to it. And so it's always fun to teach them about the cyclical nature within Eastern traditions. Yeah.
So you do Hinduism and Buddhism, and then?
We also cover Confucianism, Taoism. We talk a little bit about another branch of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. Then we move on into the Western traditions, the Abrahamic faith.
Talk about Confucius. Everyone knows Confucius is the wise man and all that.
Well, yeah, we know, many of us know Confucius by some of the wise sayings.
Right.
And, sometimes our only inspiration are fortune cookies, which don't accurately
I'm sure.
Tell us who Confucius really is. Confucius grew up in an age when social order in China was breaking down, and there was lots of chaos within the land. And Confucius sought to bring people back together. Many people may not know that Confucius wanted to be a politician, and he did not get very far in his political life. And he spent much of his time going from city-state to city-state, trying to influence political leaders or kings to take on his understanding and his values that would help bring traditional society back together and have this cohesiveness within society that he felt was breaking down, and people were losing touch with one another. And so Confucius worked on basically human relationships. The problem within Chinese society at the time was, as I mentioned, tradition was falling away. People were not being in relationship. And so Confucius's goal was to help each human individual rise to the greatest potential that they could, and to form right relationships with one another. And he had several ways of doing that. He sought to reinstitute 5 key relationships. Some examples are king and subject, having right relationship between elder siblings and younger siblings, between parent and child, between spouses. And he felt that when you got those relationships in order with one another, that society would bring itself back into line. And his teachings really have been used really up through history, all the way up until early 1900s. They were instituted as ways of teaching within the government system and ways to help relationships be fostered and to have a greater sense of who we are as a people. Mm-hmm. And so it's rather fascinating. The greatest discussion we have in Confucianism has to do with, is this really a world religion? Because, again, the ideal is to have each human reach their fullest potential and to be in right relationship with one another. And there's very little talk about a supreme other or...
so it's a sort of a humanistic approach.
Yes, exactly. A humanistic approach to a faith understanding or to a better way of living. Mm-hmm. And so it's a fascinating study. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we move on into the Abrahamic faith, and we spend about the last 6 weeks talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and how they interrelate, and then even breaking down Christianity into the 3 major branches that are found within the world today, mm-hmm. between Orthodox and Roman Catholic and Protestant traditions.
Is it true that every major world religion has a version of the Golden Rule?
Yes. I think that surprises some of the students in the class as well. There is, in one form or another, a paraphrase of what Christians would call the Golden Rule, to love the Lord your God, but basically the second half, to treat one another as you would like to be treated. It's within Judaism, Christianity, Islam, obviously Confucianism, that's the right relationships, and even within Buddhism, there is that sense that we need to treat one another as we would like to be treated, which I think adds a wonderful continuity to the course, in that when we look for similarities amongst all these faith traditions, we find that at the basis it comes down to right relationships with one another and right relationships with some kind of supreme other, whether it be God or nirvana, or just a sense that society has come back into order again. Mm-hmm. And so it's fascinating.
One of the things that fascinates you about history, going even back to the ancient Greeks, you have a society that is pulled toward humanism, toward reason, toward rational thought. On the other hand, you have the theology. You think of the Greeks as giving the Western world critical thought, but yet the Greeks also had God. Mm-hmm. As a minister, and an issue that comes up constantly are issues of science, like evolution. Mm-hmm. As a Christian, and a lot of students that we have think that this undermines religion entirely, but yet there are many Christians who say that evolution, is how God did it. How do issues like that come up in your class? Issues of science versus religion, that sort of thing?
From time to time they do. We try and have class discussions to help integrate what we've been studying, and I try and pull in some of the things that you'd read in the newspaper that are current events to help us begin thinking about issues such as that. Not so much evolution has come up lately. The biggest discussion we had at the end of last semester had to do with Christmas traditions and retail sales, in terms of, is it appropriate to say Merry Christmas within a store setting, or Happy Holidays, and how do you feel as a primarily Judeo-Christian nation? What are your thoughts on that? And the discussion was fascinating, because the students, by the end of the discussion, really felt like this was being blown out of proportion within the news media, because in their own personal dealings, going shopping and doing those kind of things, they didn't find anybody that was offended, nor we actually had a Hindu in our class last semester. He wasn't offended when people said Merry Christmas to him. And there was this sense that maybe we've gone too far to one extreme or the other, and if we would just share our faith or say what is meaningful to us, then it's up to the other person that we're speaking to decide if that's appropriate to them, and if it's not, then they can share. You know, I'm not Christian, I'm Jewish or Muslim or even Hindu, and then they can start a dialogue that way. Because that's one of the things that we talk about in our class, and that's one of the bedrock rules that we talk about from day one is, if we're going to be open to learning about these other faith traditions, tolerance has to be the key. I'm not asking anybody to give up their personal faith beliefs, but I am asking them to suspend judgment until they learn the basic and the core elements of each of the traditions as we discuss them. Because if you want to learn about these other faith traditions, and you're not willing to be open-minded, then why take the class in the first place? Because you can't think critically if you're not open to hearing other sides of the coin and seeing how other people understand their faith. And it's fun. It's fun. We get into some lively debates, but there is a sense of tolerance that pervades the atmosphere.
Well, again, getting back to the evolution issue, of course, going back to the 1920s, the Scopes trial, we talk about that in my history class. John T. Scopes from Paducah. So there's a real local connection here. And it's one of our retired professors, Dr. Dave Krieger, we talked about this one time, and he said, you know, the way that is set up, you have religion here, you have science here. Religion said science had nothing to offer. Science said religion had nothing to offer, and maybe what we need to do is this. As a minister of the gospel, but also as a rational person, I'm sure, how do you reconcile science and religion?
For me personally, I reconcile it in that they both have something to offer each other. And historically, religion and science have split apart and come back together, and split apart and come back together. From my personal standpoint, I look at evolution as God's way of starting all that we have now. And that sometimes is hard for students when we get into discussions occasionally outside of class, for them to understand that, and they think I'm being unfaithful to Christianity or to my beliefs or even to my preaching to say that those two can work simultaneously together. And I think what's missing is sometimes they don't understand where I'm coming from. I can still hold on to my Christian faith. My undergrad degree is in biology, so I love the science part, and so I've always looked for those connections. And there is no debate with me that God could have started evolution, and there is really no doubt in my mind that God did so. And so to play those themes out for students, there's a great sense of mystery involved, and I think that's what faith is about. If we knew fully all that there was to know about God, if we understood God completely or had the understanding that we did,
we'd be divine ourselves.
Exactly, which is...
I'm not.
Well, neither am I. It is... Sometimes I think there's this sense that we can speak for God, and I think we're meant to be prophetic and to share an understanding and to be into dialogue. But for any of us to say that we know God's mind really diminishes who God is. And so I have no problem talking about evolution with students.
I'll tell you a story. A professor, Mike Elliott, taught psychology here for us, has taught for many, many years. He is also a Methodist pastor and a graduate of your alma mater, Vanderbilt Divinity School. And we were talking about one time what we called the war of the bumpers. You have the Jesus fish, and you have the Darwin, I believe that's a lizard rather than a fish, the
Right.
Darwin thing.
Right.
You've got here's the Jesus fish, here's the Darwin lizard on different cars. Then I've seen them where the Jesus fish is eating the Darwin lizard with Jesus fish truth on it. So Mike decided to go to the mall here and to get them to make him a custom license plate. And his license plate has the Jesus fish kissing the Darwin lizard. Now, I'll bet that caused some head scratching as to what that. But I thought, to me, and that's what Dave Krieger was saying, and Dave was a devout Catholic. Dave was saying that science ought to be talking to religion, religion ought to be talking to science, and they can more than peacefully coexist. They can be beneficial.
Exactly, and there has been a great push, I think, for those two to come together and to kiss at least and begin the conversation. Sir John Templeton in Great Britain amassed a huge fortune through his business dealings, and he's used that great fortune to begin a dialogue and between science and religion, and there is a award that's given out annually. It's very similar in many respects to the Nobel Prize, in that he gives this award to those within science and faith communities or theological communities who have come together to begin the dialogue and to explore what it means to have those two great academic realms come together and begin dialoguing. For example, just today in the Paducah Sun, there was an article about prayer for people who have had heart surgeries, and the article, I didn't get a chance to read it all, said that people who have been prayed for haven't responded as well as those who weren't prayed for, when just 10 years ago studies were coming out from medical schools saying that people who had been prayed for after open heart surgery had better results than those who weren't being prayed for. So there is this constant push and pull of, yes, this is working, faith and science can come together and have great results, and then 10 years later the same studies being done, and there's this disconnect that's taking place. So I constantly look for how those two come together and how they work together, because I believe that God created everything that we use, and science is a part of everything. So there's a great sense of coexistence, I think.
Now, will you be teaching this class again for us?
Yes. I'll be teaching it next fall.
At the fall?
Well. Yes.
And what night will
I
it be on?
I believe next fall it will be Tuesday evenings. Tuesday.
Not Wednesday around here, because that's prayer meeting.
That's right.
You
That's
can't
right.
do
That's
that.
right.
Can't do that. Yeah.
Great meeting night
Right,
within
yeah.
faith tradition.
So Tuesday night at 6:30.
Tuesday night, I believe it's 6.
6.
6, and then spring semester the classes Monday nights from 6:30 till about 9:15.
And the title of the class is officially.
Comparative religions.
And do you know the number of the class?
I believe it is RS 105. Yes.
It's a wonderfully fascinating topic, and I could go on for hours discussing this. Unfortunately, we're about to run out of time.
Sure.
But it fascinates me. And in fact, they told us we're completely out of time, so I'll just have to leave it there. Maybe we can come back in and talk about this some more.
I'd love to.
My guest today was the Reverend J. Gottman, pastor at Paducah First Christian Church and adjunct professor of comparative religion at the college. I'm Barry Craig. We'll see you next time.